So we're shifting gears a little bit in this week's module. Previously, we looked at big sweeping historical trends and events that have shaped California's government and politics. But this week, we're going to get a little bit more political science-y by looking at the policymaking process. Policymaking is a murky, complicated process, and it's difficult for most people, even those who follow the news relatively closely, to make sense out of what's going on. So political scientists try to reduce this murkiness by developing conceptual frameworks to describe in a really structured way how policymaking works in the real world. These frameworks are basically simplified models that attempt to boil down the messy reality of the political world into an understandable structure. And that structure identifies the parts of the policymaking system as well as how they're connected together and operate together. And policy theory is a really interesting branch of political science that can be explored in a lot of depth. And if this module turns out to be your cup of tea, I would recommend and encourage you to consider taking the course Public Policy Analysis, Political Science 380 in your course catalog for a future semester. But for our purposes in this course, I want to expose you to just enough policy theory for you to feel like you have some new tools at your disposal for analyzing what you hear and what you read about policy issues in California. So this video is going to introduce some basic concepts in the field of policy studies and hopefully give you a little bit of a context to better understand the book chapter that I've assigned for you to read this week. Then, after you've done the chapter reading, I'd like you to view the second video in this module, in which we explore one particular policy framework in a bit of detail to serve as a guidepost for our understanding of housing policy issues in California. Okay, so let's get started looking at some policy concepts. Most of the general public has been exposed to a couple of really simplified views of the policymaking process. And this is what taking a political science course, studying political science is meant to help us kind of move beyond. So I'm setting up a couple of straw men, if you will, here, but the idea is to introduce you to kind of some popular models that a lot of the citizenry has in their heads about politics and how policy gets made, with the idea of then looking at the contributions that political science can make to having a more detailed and more reality-based view of what's actually going on. So our first and kind of more optimistic view of the policymaking process, kind of out there in popular culture, is what might be called the textbook process, mostly encapsulated by the Schoolhouse Rock videos that originally ran on television in the 1970s during Saturday morning cartoon programming. Now, I love these videos. For me, they were a formative part of how I learned about government, but they're pretty limited for gaining an understanding of how things work. They portray a process in which ordinary citizens contact their representatives about something they'd like to see done. The representative then drafts up a policy idea in the form of a bill, and then that bill makes its way through the legislative process of debate and votes, and ultimately approval or veto by the president. It's a really straightforward and idealized view of how ideas get introduced into the political system and then become policy in the form of laws. So a very different, much darker common view of the policymaking process is that of the shady or corrupt backroom deal. In this view, representatives get bought off by wealthy interests in exchange for enacting policies that help those wealthy interests, even if it comes at the public's expense. In this view, representative government becomes a farce, so why bother even paying attention? But to a political scientist, while there are elements of truth to both the textbook view and the backroom deal view, neither one does a particularly good job of describing reality. They're both way too simplistic for understanding much about how most government decisions actually get made. Instead, what we need is a somewhat more nuanced view of the process. One early attempt among political scientists to sort out what's going on with government decision-making was the policy stages model. This model proposed that policy tends to get made following a step-by-step process. In that respect, the policy stages model shares something in common with the approach depicted in the Schoolhouse Rock videos, just with a bit more detail and comprehensiveness. The first step in the policy stages model is agenda setting, or sometimes called problem identification. Agenda setting has to do with the issues that are under consideration by decision makers at any given point in time. Identifying agenda setting as a distinct component of the policy process is useful because it helps us to understand the actions of particular policy actors, a term for people who are active in the policy process. Think of all the issues and problems in society that government could be dealing with at any given moment. Agenda setting looks at how a handful of those issues rise to the top and occupy the attention of people with decision-making power in government. So if we want to understand agenda setting, we might look, for instance, at the media and which issues it covers and in what ways, or the governor and other prominent politicians. The issues that they champion tend to generate a lot of attention from others in the system. Or interest groups who try to gain public traction for the issues that they're concerned about. So the concept of an agenda setting stage helps us to focus in on the idea that an important part of the policymaking process is competition over the scarce resource of attention. The second step of the stages model is policy formulation. In this stage, potential solutions are developed to address the problems on the agenda. Solutions can come from a wide array of sources. They can come about as a result of holding public hearings in which citizens voice their preferences. They can come from academics and other professional specialists with expertise in a particular issue area that might be on the agenda. They can come from interest groups that conduct research on their issue of concern. Identifying policy formulation as a distinct element of the policy process is useful because it helps us to pay attention to the role that expertise and information play in the decision-making process. It also cues us to look at the values and ideologies of decision makers, as certain types of information get privileged status and other types get ignored. The next stage in the model is policy adoption. This is when a proposed solution, in other words, a proposed policy, goes through the formal government decision-making process. Policy-making decisions can occur in a wide variety of different institutional settings within government. But when we're talking about big policy changes, we're usually talking about the passage of new laws. So it's useful for us to know a little something about the rules in place for creating new law. Identifying policy adoption as a specific element of the process helps us identify the ways in which institutional rules and structures either help or hinder the adoption of new policies. So for example, what's the partisan balance in state government? The fact that Democrats have a supermajority in both chambers of the California state legislature and have a Democratic governor should make it easier to adopt new policies that have a partisan element to them. But even so, as you'll see when you read the Rolling Stone article, the lawmaking process is filled with what are called veto points, where a proposed policy can be stopped dead in its tracks, even if it has majority support overall. You're probably familiar with the word veto and know that the president can use that power to stop a bill passed by Congress from becoming law. Similarly, in California, the governor has the veto power to stop a bill passed by the state legislature from becoming law. But beyond that formal veto power, there are also so-called veto points in the system, like when a committee chairman, one person in the legislature, chooses not to act on a bill, effectively denying its chance for passage. The idea here is that looking at the formal lawmaking process reveals how relatively difficult it is to adopt major new policies. The next stage in the model is policy implementation. So, after a policy has been formally adopted, it has to be carried out in the real world to actually solve the problem that it's meant to address. Policies are usually implemented by government bureaucracies. These government agencies have the critically important task of translating law into an actual functioning program. Oftentimes, policies are adopted in a way in which it's left up to experts within the bureaucratic agencies to try to figure out the technical details about how to structure the government program. In other words, say the legislature, as they're passing a bill, feel like they don't have sufficient technical expertise to write down all the fine details into the law. So they basically leave it up to the bureaucracy to figure out those fine details. So that can have a huge impact in terms of how a policy is actually carried out in the real world. And on this slide, I've depicted a cartoon that shows the process of trying to get a building permit from a local government bureaucracy as kind of being something like navigating your way through a labyrinth. And this seemed particularly on point since we're looking at the housing crisis in California this week. And the last stage of the process is policy evaluation. In this stage, data is collected and results are analyzed relating to the effects or consequences of the policy. And based on the results, the whole cycle can start all over again. The idea is that policy is supposed to follow a rational, orderly sequence. The policy stages model makes some worthwhile contributions that can enhance our understanding of the policy process. Each identified stage highlights a conceptually distinct element of the policymaking process. But the key weakness of the stages model is that policy does not proceed in a neat, linear fashion. Instead, most policy actors, people who are active in the policymaking process, they're involved in most stages simultaneously. It's a much messier and much more dynamic process than the stages model lets on. So to take the issue of housing, for example, housing rights activists are continually involved in agenda setting by trying to gain more and more media coverage and government attention drawn to the issues of homelessness and housing affordability. At the same time, they're also active in policy formulation, proposing ideas for what they see as the best solutions to the state's housing crisis. And still at the same time, these same housing rights activist groups are active in policy adoption by lobbying representatives, say in the state capitol, to enact bills that they favor. And yet again, they're involved in policy implementation, trying to persuade bureaucratic agencies to make changes in the ways that those agencies administer housing programs, in ways to try to foster greater affordability of housing. And they're involved in policy evaluation at the same time, conducting detailed studies about the effects of housing policies that have been adopted in the past, not just in California, but also in other states and even in other countries, to try to better understand what types of policies best achieve their goals. And that's just the housing rights groups. You've also got other groups with different interests in housing policy that are very active in the policymaking process. You've got lawmakers themselves and how they view their job in the policymaking process. You've got academics and universities publishing studies about housing policy. You've got individual media outlets shining a public light on different aspects of the housing story at different points in time. And you've got planners and other professionals in state and local government agencies with years of experience carrying out housing programs. Many of these folks are also active in different stages of the policymaking process at the same time. So we need some additional ideas for sorting all of this out. So now I want you to proceed to read the book chapter I've assigned for this module. And in that chapter, the author outlines some general ways in which policy scholars sort out some of this complexity beyond just the policy stages model.